The dust cloud on the horizon was the first sign of life Matthew Blackburn had seen in 3 days of riding through the desolate Texas landscape of 1876. He reined in his horse, squinting against the harsh afternoon sun as the silhouette of a small, crumpled form gradually took shape amid the swirling dirt. It wasn't until he dismounted that he realized it was a boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, lying motionless on the parched earth, his skin caked with the same reddish-brown dust that covered everything in this forsaken stretch of frontier. Matthew knelt beside the child, his weathered hand checking for a pulse. Relief washed over him when he felt the faint but steady beat beneath his fingertips. The boy was alive, but barely. His clothes were tattered, his frame painfully thin, and his face smudged with tear tracks cutting through the dust. "Hey there, little one," Matthew whispered, gently shaking the boy's shoulder. When no response came, he shrugged off his worn leather coat and carefully draped it over the small body. "It's okay, son. You're safe now." The word felt strange on his lips. At 32, Matthew had long ago resigned himself to a solitary life, one that left no room for family or attachments. 15 years of driving cattle, breaking horses, and drifting from one ranch to another had hardened him in ways he sometimes didn't recognize. Yet something about this child stirred emotions he thought he'd buried years ago. He lifted the boy into his arms, surprised at how little he weighed, and carried him to his horse. With practiced ease, Matthew mounted, keeping the child secure against his chest. The nearest town was Clearwater Springs, still a good 20 miles ahead. He would need to make it before nightfall. As they rode, Matthew contemplated what circumstances could have left a child alone in such unforgiving territory. Indian attacks had become less frequent in recent years, but outlaws still plagued the region. Or perhaps the boy's family had succumbed to one of the many diseases that ravaged isolated homesteads. Whatever the case, Matthew knew the boy's chances of survival hinged on getting him to proper care quickly. The sun was beginning its descent when the child stirred against him, eyes fluttering open to reveal a startling blue that reminded Matthew of the mountain lakes of his Colorado youth. Confusion, then fear, swept across the boy's face. "Easy there," Matthew said softly. "You're okay." The boy struggled weakly. "My paw. Where's my paw?" Matthew steadied him with a gentle hand. "I don't know, son. I found you alone out there in the dust. What's your name?" "Samuel," the child whispered, his voice cracking from thirst. Matthew reached for his canteen, helping the boy take small sips. "Samuel Morgan." "I'm Matthew Blackburn. You can call me Matt." He offered a reassuring smile. "We're heading to town to get you some help. Can you tell me what happened?" "Where's your family?" Samuel's eyes welled with tears. "The bad men came. Pa told me to run and hide. I heard shots. I ran and ran until I couldn't no more." His small body shook with silent sobs. Matthew felt a surge of anger at whoever had traumatized this child, followed by an unfamiliar protective instinct. "You're safe now, Samuel. I won't let anything happen to you." The town of Clearwater Springs appeared as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Despite its modest size, the settlement boasted a doctor, a necessity in the dangerous frontier. Matthew headed straight for the whitewashed building that served as both doctor's office and residence, dismounting carefully while keeping Samuel secure in his arms. Dr. Jenkins, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and a perpetually worried expression, answered Matthew's urgent knock. "Blackburn? Didn't expect to see you back so soon. What have we here?" "Found him collapsed in the dust about 20 miles east," Matthew explained as he carried Samuel inside. "Been out there who knows how long. Says outlaws attacked his family." The doctor motioned to a small examination table. "Set him down here. Vera," he called toward the back room, "bring some clean water and towels." A young woman appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of the dust-covered boy. Matthew found himself momentarily stunned. In all his years riding through Clearwater Springs, he'd never encountered her before. She couldn't be more than 25, with amber hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent green eyes that assessed the situation quickly. "Right away, Uncle," she replied, disappearing briefly before returning with a basin of water and clean linens. "This is my niece, Vera Winters," Dr. Jenkins explained as he began examining Samuel. "She arrived from Boston last month to assist me." Matthew nodded politely, suddenly conscious of his own dust-covered appearance and the 3-day stubble on his jaw. "Madam?" Vera didn't respond immediately, focused on gently cleaning Samuel's face with a damp cloth. Her touch was tender but efficient, a healer's touch. When she finally looked up at Matthew, there was no judgment in her eyes, only curiosity. "You found him alone? In this heat?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent that stood out in the rough-edged frontier town. "Yes, madam. Looked like he'd been walking for days." Dr. Jenkins finished his initial examination with a troubled sigh. Dehydration, exhaustion, some minor cuts and bruises. Nothing broken, thankfully. He needs rest, food, and plenty of water. He turned to Matthew. "What do you know of his family?" Matthew shook his head. "Only what he told me on the ride in. Named Samuel Morgan. Said bad men attacked his home, and his father told him to run." "The Morgan homestead," the doctor mused. "About 30 miles east of here. Good people. Thomas Morgan and his wife settled there maybe 3 years ago." His expression darkened. "If there was trouble out that way, we should notify Sheriff Dawson." "I'll speak with him," Matthew offered, his eyes drifting back to Samuel, who had fallen asleep during the examination. Something about the boy's vulnerable form stirred a fierce determination within him. "And I'll check on the homestead tomorrow, see what happened." Vera looked up sharply. "That could be dangerous if these bad men are still around." A hint of a smile touched Matthew's lips. "Danger and I are old acquaintances, Miss Winters." "And what of the boy?" she pressed. "He can't stay here indefinitely. The doctor's office isn't equipped for long-term care." Before Matthew could respond, Dr. Jenkins interjected. "He can stay with us for a few days, at least until we know more about his situation." He gave his niece a meaningful look. "We have the spare room." Vera nodded. Though Matthew detected a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, he wondered about her story, what had brought an educated Eastern woman to this dusty corner of Texas. "I appreciate your help," Matthew said, reaching for his hat. "I should see the sheriff before it gets too late." "Wait," Vera called as he turned to leave. She hesitated, then continued. "Will you come back? To check on him, I mean. He might be frightened waking up among strangers." Matthew considered her request. He had planned to ride out at first light, to investigate the Morgan homestead and then continue on his way. Attachments weren't part of his life's blueprint. And yet, "I'll be back," he promised, his eyes meeting hers briefly before shifting to the sleeping boy. "Tomorrow morning." As Matthew stepped out into the cooling evening air, he felt strangely unsettled. For 15 years he'd been a drifter, carrying everything he owned on his horse, never staying in one place long enough to form connections. Now, in the span of a few hours, he'd made promises to an orphaned boy and a green-eyed doctor's niece from Boston. Sheriff Dawson's office was just down the main street, a simple wooden structure with jail cells in the back. The lawman was at his desk, looking through wanted posters when Matthew entered. "Blackburn," he acknowledged with a nod. "Heard you brought in a half-dead kid to Doc Jenkins. Found him out on the trail?" Matthew removed his hat, running a hand through his dust-coated hair. "Morgan boy. Says outlaws hit his family's homestead. I'm heading out there tomorrow to see what happened." Dawson's expression hardened. "Thomas Morgan's boy? Damn." He stood, strapping on his gun belt. "I know that family. Good people. If somebody hit their place, I need to know about it." He regarded Matthew thoughtfully. "Ride with me tomorrow? Could use an extra gun if there's trouble." Matthew hesitated. He preferred working alone, but the sheriff was right. If the attackers were still in the area, two men stood a better chance than one. "I'll meet you here at dawn." After arranging the details with Dawson, Matthew secured a room at the boarding house and sought out the bathhouse. An hour later, clean-shaven and wearing fresh clothes, he sat in the small dining room, mechanically eating a plate of stew, while his mind wandered back to the doctor's office, to the sleeping boy and the woman with the gentle hands and questioning eyes. Sleep came fitfully that night. Haunted by dreams of his own past of being 13 years old and watching his family's farm burn, of running until his legs gave out, of the kindness of strangers that had both saved and shaped him. By the time dawn broke, Matthew was already dressed and heading toward the sheriff's office, determined to discover what had happened to Samuel Morgan's family. Sheriff Dawson was waiting, mounted on a sturdy bay gelding. Together, they rode east in the cool morning air, following the rough trail that led to the scattered homesteads beyond town. "Morgan came here from Tennessee about 3 years back," Dawson explained as they rode. "Wife died in childbirth shortly after they arrived. Left him with the boy and a newborn daughter. Hard-working man, kept to himself mostly." "Daughter?" Matthew frowned. "Samuel didn't mention a sister." Dawson shrugged. "Girl would be about 3 now. Mary, I think her name is." Matthew's concern deepened. A 3-year-old alone, or worse, in the hands of the men who had attacked the homestead? The thought spurred him to urge his horse faster, despite knowing that after several days, the chances of finding anyone alive were slim. The Morgan homestead came into view around mid-morning, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral, situated near a creek that provided precious water in the arid landscape. Even from a distance, Matthew could see that something was wrong. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the front door swung open in the breeze. They approached cautiously, guns drawn. The signs of violence were immediately apparent. Bullet holes pockmarked the cabin's front, and dark stains that could only be blood marred the dusty ground near the porch. "Cover me," Dawson muttered, dismounting and approaching the open door. Matthew kept his rifle ready, scanning the surrounding area for any movement. The sheriff's grim expression when he emerged from the cabin confirmed Matthew's fears. "Thomas Morgan's dead inside. Been there a few days from the look of it." He shook his head. "No sign of the little girl." They searched the property methodically, finding more evidence of the attack, but no trace of Mary Morgan. In the barn, they discovered the family's horse shot dead, and signs that supplies had been hastily loaded onto wagon or pack animals. "Looks like a raid," Dawson concluded, his face lined with anger. "Take what you can carry. Kill anyone who resists." Matthew nodded, kneeling to examine tracks leading away from the homestead. 3, maybe 4 riders, headed south. He stood, brushing dust from his pants. "We should bury Morgan before we head back." They worked in silence, digging a grave behind the cabin. As they lowered Thomas Morgan's body into the earth, Matthew couldn't help but think of the boy waiting back in town, unaware that he was now truly an orphan. And somewhere out there, possibly, a 3-year-old girl in the hands of killers. The sun was high overhead when they finished, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. As they prepared to leave, Matthew made a decision. "I'm going after them," he told Dawson. "If there's any chance the girl is alive." The sheriff studied him with a mixture of respect and concern. "Those tracks are days old, Blackburn, and you barely know these people." Matthew couldn't explain the compulsion he felt, not fully understanding it himself. "I know what it's like to lose everything as a child," he said finally. "I know what it does to you." Dawson seemed to consider arguing further, then simply nodded. "All right. But first, we go back to town." You'll need supplies, and we should tell the boy what we found. He paused. And what we didn't find. Matthew agreed reluctantly. He was anxious to follow the trail while it was still visible. But Dawson was right. He needed supplies for what could be a long pursuit. And Samuel deserved to know the truth, harsh as it was. They rode back to Clearwater Springs in tense silence, arriving as afternoon shadows lengthened across the main street. Matthew's first stop was the doctor's office, his heart heavy with the news he carried. Dr. Jenkins answered his knock, ushering him inside with a worried expression. "The boy's been asking for you," he said quietly, "been fretting all day." In the small bedroom at the back of the house, Matthew found Samuel sitting up in bed, looking considerably better than the day before. Vera sat beside him, reading from a book that she quickly set aside when Matthew entered. "Mr. Blackburn." Samuel's face lit up, then immediately fell as he registered Matthew's expression. "Did you find my paw?" Matthew removed his hat, exchanging a brief glance with Vera before sitting on the edge of the bed. "Samuel, I need to tell you something difficult," he began gently. "The sheriff and I rode out to your home today." The boy's lower lip trembled. "Pa's not coming, is he?" Matthew placed a hand on the small shoulder. "I'm sorry, son. Your father fought bravely, but he didn't make it." He hesitated before asking, "Samuel, the sheriff mentioned you have a little sister. Mary?" Samuel's eyes widened in panic. "Mary, where is she? Is she okay?" "We don't know," Matthew admitted. "We didn't find her at the homestead." The boy burst into tears, his small body shaking with grief. Without thinking, Matthew gathered him into his arms, holding him as sobs racked his thin frame. Over Samuel's head, he met Vera's gaze, seeing her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm going after the men who did this," Matthew told Samuel when the crying had subsided to hiccups. "If your sister is with them, I'll find her and bring her back. I promise you that." "Take me with you," Samuel pleaded, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "I want to help find Mary." Matthew shook his head firmly. "It's too dangerous, and you're still recovering. You need to stay here where it's safe." "But I'm all alone now," the boy whispered, fresh tears spilling. Vera spoke then, her voice gentle but resolute. "You're not alone, Samuel. You'll stay with me and my uncle while Mr. Blackburn searches for your sister." Matthew glanced at her in surprise. "You'd do that?" "Of course," she replied simply. "What else would we do?" There was something in her steady gaze that touched Matthew deeply. In a world where self-interest typically prevailed, such unquestioning kindness was rare. He found himself wondering again about Vera Winters and what had shaped her into this compassionate woman. "I'll leave at first light," Matthew said, standing. "The trail's already days old." Vera rose as well. "May I speak with you outside, Mr. Blackburn?" In the hallway, she closed the bedroom door and turned to him with concern etched on her features. "This is madness. Following armed killers alone? You could be riding to your death." "I've handled worse odds," he replied, though her concern warmed him in an unexpected way. "And if you find the girl? What then? A lone man with a small child, possibly pursued by outlaws?" She shook her head. "At least take someone with you." "There's no one to take. The sheriff can't leave town unprotected, and most men around here have their own concerns." He studied her face, noting the determination in her eyes. "Why do you care what happens to me, Miss Winters? We're practically strangers." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "I care about that boy in there, who's already lost too much. And I care about a 3-year-old girl who may still be alive, frightened and alone." She hesitated. "And perhaps I recognize something in you, Mr. Blackburn, something that makes me believe you might actually succeed where others would fail." Her words stirred something inside him, a long, dormant part of himself that responded to her faith in him. Before he could reply, Dr. Jenkins appeared from his office. "Blackburn, a word," he said, gesturing for Matthew to follow him. In the privacy of his office, the doctor spoke frankly. "Sheriff Dawson told me what you found, and what you plan to do." Matthew nodded. "I'll be gone by morning." "The boy needs stability now, not more uncertainty." The doctor's expression was grave. "If you go, make sure it's with the intention of returning. Don't give him false hope." "I don't make promises I can't keep, Doc," Matthew said quietly. "If I find his sister, I'll bring her back." "And then what?" Jenkins challenged. "Two orphaned children with nowhere to go?" The question caught Matthew off guard. He hadn't thought beyond finding Mary, hadn't considered the longer-term implications. "I don't know," he admitted. The doctor sighed, suddenly looking his age. "These children will need someone, Blackburn. The boy's already attached to you." Matthew felt a weight settle on his shoulders. For 15 years he'd avoided attachments, responsibilities. The freedom of the trail had been his only constant companion. Yet in the span of a day, everything had shifted. "Let me find the girl first," he said finally. "Then we'll figure out what comes next." That evening, Matthew made his preparations methodically. He purchased supplies at the general store, had his horse reshod at the blacksmith's, and cleaned his weapons with practiced precision. The sheriff provided what information he had about the region south of the Morgan homestead, a sparsely populated area with rugged terrain that offered plenty of hiding places for those avoiding the law. As darkness fell, Matthew found himself drawn back to the doctor's house, ostensibly to check on Samuel one last time before departing. The boy was asleep when he arrived, but Vera invited him in for coffee, which he accepted despite knowing he should get rest before the long ride ahead. They sat in the small kitchen, the lamplight casting warm shadows across the wooden table between them. For a few moments, neither spoke, the silence comfortable rather than awkward. "Why did you come to Clearwater Springs?" Matthew finally asked, curious about this woman who seemed so out of place in the frontier town. Vera cradled her coffee cup, staring into its depths as if searching for words. "My father died last year, pneumonia. He was a doctor in Boston, quite respected." A sad smile touched her lips. "My mother had passed years earlier, and suddenly I found myself alone, with no real purpose." "So you came to Texas? That's quite a change from Boston." She nodded. "Uncle William Dr. Jenkins wrote that he needed help. The town was growing, and he couldn't manage alone anymore." Her eyes met his. "Everyone thought I was mad to come, a single woman traveling west to a frontier town, but I needed something, something beyond the restricted life laid out for me in Boston." Matthew found himself nodding in understanding. "Freedom," he said softly, "the chance to choose your own path." "Yes," she agreed, looking slightly surprised at his perception. "Though I'm finding that freedom out here comes with its own constraints. Different ones, perhaps, but still present." "The frontier isn't kind to anyone," Matthew acknowledged. "Least of all women on their own." Vera straightened slightly. "I'm not looking for kindness, Mr. Blackburn. Just the opportunity to be useful, to make my own decisions." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "And what about you? What drives a man to spend 15 years drifting from place to place?" Matthew rarely spoke of his past, but something about Vera's direct gaze made evasion seem dishonest. "I was 13 when raiders hit our farm in Colorado. My parents, my sister, all gone in one night." He took a sip of coffee, buying time against the memories. "A rancher found me, took me in, taught me to ride, shoot, work cattle. When I was 17, I struck out on my own. Never stayed anywhere long since then." "Running from something or toward something?" she asked perceptively. The question caught him off guard. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted, Just never found a reason to put down roots, I suppose. Vera's expression softened. And now? This mission to find Samuel's sister, is that just another job? Or something more? Matthew considered her question seriously. I'm not sure, he said honestly, but I know I can't ride away without trying. Their conversation continued as the evening deepened, touching on books they'd read, places they'd seen, experiences that had shaped them. Matthew found himself speaking more openly than he had in years, drawn by Vera's intelligence and genuine interest. When he finally rose to leave, the clock on the mantel showed it was well past midnight. I should go, he said reluctantly. Long ride tomorrow. At the door, Vera hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pressed something into his hand. It was a small locket on a silver chain. It was my mother's, she explained. A good luck charm of sorts. I'd like you to take it with you. Matthew stared at the delicate piece of jewelry. I can't accept this. Please, she insisted. Consider it a token to ensure your return. Samuel will be waiting, and... She paused, color rising in her cheeks. I would like to continue our conversation when you get back. Their eyes met, and Matthew felt something shift between them, an unspoken connection that both thrilled and terrified him. I'll bring it back to you, he promised, carefully tucking the locket into his shirt pocket. Dawn found Matthew already miles south of Clearwater Springs, following the faint trail left by the raiders. The tracks led through increasingly rugged country, winding between rocky hills and across dry creek beds. By midday, he had covered significant ground, but the trail was becoming harder to follow as the terrain grew more challenging. He made camp that night in a sheltered gully, keeping his fire small and staying alert for any signs of trouble. As he sat against his saddle, eating jerky and hardtack, his hand strayed to the locket in his pocket. He opened it to find a tiny portrait inside a young Vera with a woman who must have been her mother, their smiles almost identical. The simple intimacy of the gesture touched him deeply. For 3 days, Matthew tracked the raiders southward, each day bringing him closer but also increasing the danger. On the 4th day, he spotted smoke rising from a canyon ahead. Approaching cautiously, he left his horse tethered in a stand of scrub oak and continued on foot, rifle in hand. From a ridge overlooking the canyon, he could see a small camp below 3 men seated around a fire, a wagon nearby, and several horses in a makeshift corral. Of Mary Morgan, there was no immediate sign. Matthew studied the men carefully through his field glasses. Rough-looking characters, heavily armed, exactly the type who would raid isolated homesteads for easy pickings. He watched them for over an hour, waiting and observing. Finally, his patience was rewarded when one of the men approached the wagon and emerged with a small, struggling figure, a little girl with tangled blonde hair, her dress dirty but intact. Relief flooded through Matthew at the sight. Mary was alive, though clearly frightened and unhappy. The challenge now was extracting her from 3 armed men in an open camp. A direct confrontation could put the child in danger, but waiting for nightfall might provide an opportunity. Matthew settled into his observation point, planning his approach carefully. As dusk gathered, the outlaws finished a meal and began passing a bottle between them. Matthew watched as they grew increasingly intoxicated, their voices louder, their movements less coordinated. One of them eventually picked up Mary and carried her back to the wagon, securing the canvas flap behind her. Matthew waited until full dark, when 2 of the men had rolled into their blankets near the dying fire, while the third took first watch, sitting on a rock with a rifle across his knees. Moving silently, Matthew circled the camp, approaching from behind the wagon where the guard wouldn't easily spot him. The wagon canvas parted silently under his knife. Inside, he could make out the small form of Mary Morgan, curled up asleep on a pile of blankets. Matthew reached in gently, placing a hand over her mouth to prevent any sound as he woke her. The child's eyes flew open in terror, but Matthew quickly whispered, "I'm a friend of Samuel's. I've come to take you to him." At the mention of her brother's name, Mary stopped struggling. Matthew carefully lifted her out through the slit in the canvas, holding her close as he began his retreat from the camp. They had almost reached the ridge when disaster struck. Mary's foot caught on a loose rock, sending it tumbling down the slope with a clatter that seemed deafening in the night silence. "Who's there?" The guard's voice rang out, followed by the sound of a rifle being cocked. Matthew didn't hesitate. Holding Mary tightly with one arm, he ran, no longer concerned with stealth. Behind them, shouts erupted as the outlaws discovered their prisoner missing. A shot cracked through the darkness, the bullet whining past overhead. Matthew reached his horse and swung into the saddle, settling Mary in front of him. He spurred the animal forward just as more shots rang out, the outlaws now in pursuit. The horse responded gallantly, surging up the rocky slope and into the darkness beyond. They rode hard through the night, Matthew constantly alert for sounds of pursuit. Mary clung to him silently, her small body trembling with fear and exhaustion. When they reached a stream several hours later, Matthew finally slowed, allowing the horse to drink while he assessed their situation. "Are you hurt, Mary?" he asked gently, helping her down from the saddle. The little girl shook her head, her eyes huge in her dirt-smudged face. "Where's Sammy?" she asked in a small voice. "Safe in town," Matthew assured her, offering his canteen. "We'll get you to him soon. I promise." Mary drank thirstily, then looked up at him with solemn eyes. "The bad men hurt Papa." Matthew's heart constricted. "I know, little one. I'm sorry." "Are they coming after us?" He glanced back the way they had come, listening intently. "Maybe, but we have a good head start, and I know these hills better than they do." It wasn't entirely true, but he needed to reassure her. They rested briefly before continuing north, Matthew setting a pace that balanced speed with the need to preserve his horse's strength. Mary eventually fell asleep against his chest, her small hands clutching his shirt. Matthew found himself fiercely protective of this tiny, vulnerable child, a feeling that extended to her brother waiting in Clearwater Springs, and to the woman who had entrusted him with her mother's locket. Dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the landscape in hues of gold and rose. Matthew estimated they were still at least a day's ride from the Morgan homestead, and another half-day beyond that to Clearwater Springs. They would need to stop soon to rest the horse and find food for Mary. Around mid-morning, they came upon a small natural spring sheltered by cottonwood trees. Matthew dismounted carefully, holding Mary as he slid from the saddle. He helped her drink from the cool, clear water, then shared the last of his jerky with her. "Mr. Blackburn?" Mary asked as she chewed thoughtfully. "Are you going to be our new papa?" The innocent question caught Matthew completely off guard. No, Mary. I'm just helping you get back to your brother." She frowned, considering this. "But who will take care of us then?" It was the same question Dr. Jenkins had raised, one Matthew had deliberately avoided contemplating. Looking at Mary's trusting face, he felt the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. "There are good people in town who will help," he said finally. "Dr. Jenkins and his niece, Miss Winters." Mary seemed to accept this answer, though her next question struck even closer to home. "Don't you have a family?" Matthew shook his head. "No, I travel alone." "That's sad," Mary declared with a child's straightforward honesty. "Everyone needs a family." Before Matthew could formulate a response, a sound caught his attention: hoofbeats approaching from the south. He quickly gathered Mary into his arms and moved toward the cover of the trees, drawing his revolver. 3 riders appeared on the ridge above the spring. Even at this distance, Matthew recognized them as the outlaws from the camp. They had tracked him more effectively than he'd anticipated. "Stay very quiet," he whispered to Mary, setting her down behind the broad trunk of a cottonwood. "Don't move from here, no matter what happens." The child nodded, her eyes wide with fear as Matthew moved away from her, positioning himself to defend their position. He whistled softly, calling his horse closer to provide additional cover for Mary's hiding place. The outlaws spotted the horse and approached cautiously, rifles ready. Matthew waited until they were within range before calling out, "That's far enough." The riders halted, scanning the trees for the source of the voice. "We just want the girl," one of them shouted back. "Hand her over and you can ride away." "Not going to happen," Matthew replied calmly, sighting down his rifle at the speaker. "Best turn around and forget you ever saw her." A harsh laugh answered him. "3 against 1, mister. Bad odds for you." "I've faced worse," Matthew said, squeezing the trigger. The shot caught the lead outlaw in the shoulder, knocking him backward off his horse. The other 2 men scattered, seeking cover as they returned fire. Bullets thudded into the trees around Matthew as he shifted position, trying to keep the outlaw's attention away from where Mary was hidden. The gunfight continued for several tense minutes, neither side gaining a clear advantage. Matthew managed to wound a second outlaw, but the third was proving more elusive, circling around to approach from a different angle. A child's scream suddenly pierced the air. Matthew turned to see the third outlaw dragging Mary from her hiding place, using her as a shield. "Drop your gun," the man snarled, pressing his revolver against Mary's head, "or the girl dies right now." Matthew's blood ran cold. He had failed in his promise to keep her safe. Slowly, he lowered his rifle to the ground, mind racing for a solution. "Smart move," the outlaw sneered, backing away with Mary still clutched against him. "Billings, you still alive?" The wounded leader staggered to his feet, blood staining his shirt. "Yeah. Get the girl on a horse. We're leaving." Matthew watched helplessly as they prepared to take Mary, knowing that if they succeeded, he would never find her again. His hand moved imperceptibly toward the knife in his boot, calculating distances and angles. Before he could act, a shot rang out from the ridge behind the outlaws. The man holding Mary jerked violently, releasing her as he crumpled to the ground. More shots followed in quick succession, dropping the second outlaw. The leader, Billings, managed to mount his horse and flee, disappearing over the ridge. Matthew lunged forward, grabbing Mary and pulling her to safety behind the trees. As the echoes of gunfire faded, he scanned the ridge anxiously, unsure if their rescuer was friend or foe. A lone rider appeared, approaching slowly with a rifle held non-threateningly across the saddle. As the figure drew closer, Matthew stared in disbelief. "Thought you might need some help," Vera Winters called, a tentative smile on her dust-streaked face as she dismounted. Matthew could only stare, wondering if exhaustion had him hallucinating. "Miss Winters, why?" Vera approached, her eyes quickly finding Mary huddled against Matthew's side. "Hello there," she said gently, kneeling to the child's level. "You must be Mary. Your brother Samuel has been very worried about you." Mary regarded her suspiciously for a moment before asking, "You know Sammy?" "Yes. He's staying with me and my uncle in town. He's getting stronger every day, but he misses you terribly." Mary's face lit up, and she turned to Matthew for confirmation. When he nodded, she threw her arms around Vera's neck in a spontaneous hug that seemed to surprise the woman as much as it did Matthew. "You still haven't explained what you're doing here," Matthew said when Vera stood, Mary still clinging to her hand. "It's 2 days' ride from town, and dangerous country." Vera brushed dust from her riding skirt, a garment Matthew noted was both practical and clearly designed for serious travel. "Samuel told me more about the raiders' details he remembered that might help locate them. I shared the information with Sheriff Dawson, who recognized the description of one man Billings, a known outlaw with a distinctive scar." "That doesn't explain why you're here instead of the sheriff," Matthew pressed. A flash of irritation crossed Vera's face. Because Dawson was called away to handle trouble north of town, and I wasn't about to sit around waiting when a child's life was at stake. Her expression softened slightly. I grew up riding with my father on his rounds. I know how to handle myself, Mr. Blackburn, despite what you might think of Eastern women. Matthew shook his head, caught between admiration and exasperation. It was reckless. It was necessary, she countered. And judging by what I just interrupted, not a moment too soon. He couldn't argue with that. Thank you, he said simply, for Mary's life. And mine. Vera's expression gentled further. You're welcome. Now, shall we get this little one back to her brother? They gathered the outlaw's horses, securing the bodies across the saddles to return to town for proper burial and identification. Billings had escaped, but with two of his companions dead and him wounded, Matthew doubted he would risk coming after them again. Mary rode with Vera, clearly having formed an immediate attachment to the woman who had helped rescue her. Matthew led the string of horses with their grim cargo, his mind wrestling with conflicting emotions. Relief at Mary's safety warred with confusion over Vera's presence and her unexpected skill with a rifle. And beneath it all ran a deeper current, the realization that something fundamental had shifted within him during this journey. They made camp that evening in a protected hollow, far from the site of the gunfight. After settling Mary to sleep, wrapped in a blanket near the fire, Matthew and Vera sat across from each other, the flames casting flickering shadows between them. You're angry with me, Vera observed quietly. Matthew poked at the fire with a stick. Not angry. Confused. Maybe. You put yourself in considerable danger. So did you, she pointed out. Difference is, no one questioned your right to do so. It's not about rights, Miss Winters. It's about experience, training. Both of which I have, she interrupted. Perhaps not in the same way as you, but sufficient for the task. She leaned forward, her expression earnest in the firelight. My father believed women should be capable of defending themselves. He taught me to ride, to shoot, to think critically in dangerous situations. Matthew studied her with new respect. Your father sounds like an unusual man for Boston society. A sad smile touched her lips. He was. After my mother died, he raised me alone, with little regard for convention. It's partly why I never fit in there. She glanced at Mary's sleeping form. What will happen to them now? The abrupt change of subject caught Matthew off guard. I don't know, he admitted. There's no other family that I'm aware of. They could become wards of the county, Vera said thoughtfully, but that often means separation, especially with the age difference. The thought of Samuel and Mary being separated after all they'd endured was unbearable. There must be another solution, Matthew insisted. Vera was quiet for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. My uncle has been considering retirement, she finally said. He's been experiencing chest pains lately, though he tries to hide it from me. He's mentioned returning to Philadelphia, where our family has connections. She hesitated. I've been wondering what that means for my future in Clearwater Springs. You'd go back east? Matthew asked, surprised at the pang of disappointment the thought evoked. Not necessarily. I've grown attached to the town, to the work. She met his gaze directly. If I were to stay, establish my own practice perhaps, I could provide a home for the children. Matthew stared at her, genuinely stunned by the offer. You'd do that? Take responsibility for two orphaned children you barely know? Is it so different from what you did, riding after outlaws to rescue a girl you'd never met? She challenged. He had no answer for that. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew her locket. I believe this belongs to you. It seems to have brought the luck you promised. Vera shook her head. Keep it a while longer. We're not home yet. The word home lingered between them, loaded with meaning neither was ready to fully examine. They finished their watch in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts about the future and the unexpected bonds forming between them. The next morning dawned clear and mild, perfect traveling weather. They made good time, reaching the vicinity of the Morgan homestead by late afternoon. Matthew suggested bypassing it entirely. There was nothing there for the children now, but painful memories. But Vera disagreed. Mary should have the chance to say goodbye, she argued quietly while the girl was occupied picking wildflowers nearby. And there might be personal items, keepsakes they'd want to have. Reluctantly, Matthew agreed, and they approached the silent homestead as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The grave he and Sheriff Dawson had dug for Thomas Morgan was visible behind the cabin, the simple wooden cross stark against the landscape. Mary recognized her home immediately, her small face lighting up before clouding with confusion. "Where's Papa?" she asked, looking around expectantly. Matthew exchanged a pained glance with Vera, who nodded encouragingly. Kneeling before the child, he gently explained that her father was gone to heaven, like her mother before him. Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she seemed to understand in the way children sometimes grasp the permanence of death more readily than adults expect. "Can I say goodbye?" she asked in a small voice. Matthew carried her to the grave, standing back respectfully as the little girl placed her wildflowers on the fresh earth and whispered her farewell. Vera stood beside him, her hand finding his in a gesture of shared emotion that felt entirely natural. Afterward, they entered the cabin together. The interior was much as Matthew remembered, though Sheriff Dawson had clearly returned to remove Thomas Morgan's body and straighten things somewhat. Vera helped Mary gather a few precious items: a handmade quilt, a small wooden horse that had belonged to Samuel, a locket containing a portrait of their mother. As they prepared to leave, Matthew noticed Mary yawning, the emotional day taking its toll on her young reserves. Without discussion, he and Vera decided to spend the night at the homestead rather than pushing on to town. They prepared a simple meal from the supplies they carried, and Vera settled Mary to sleep in her own small bed, perhaps for the last time. Sitting on the porch steps in the gathering darkness, Matthew felt Vera's presence beside him as a comfort rather than an intrusion on his solitude. "You're good with her," he observed. "With children in general, I suspect." Vera smiled faintly. "I always wanted a family of my own. It seemed unlikely in Boston I was considered too opinionated, too educated for most potential suitors." She glanced at him sideways. "Out here, those same qualities make me useful, rather than unmarriageable." "More than useful," Matthew said quietly. "Extraordinary." The word hung between them, weighted with an admiration that went beyond respect for her skills. Vera's cheeks colored slightly in the dim light. "And what about you, Mr. Blackburn? What do you want from life, beyond the freedom of the trail?" It was a question he'd avoided for 15 years, one he'd never allowed himself to consider seriously. Now, sitting beside this remarkable woman on the porch of a dead man's home, with an orphaned child sleeping inside who somehow depended on him, the answer seemed both terrifying and inevitable. "I think," he said slowly, "I might want roots, a place to belong, people who—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "matter." Vera's hand found his again, her fingers warm and strong. "People who matter to you, or to whom you matter?" "Both," he admitted. "Is that selfish?" "No," she said softly. "It's human." They sat in silence as stars appeared overhead, neither willing to break the connection between them by moving away. Eventually Vera spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "There's a small house available on the edge of town. Dr. Reynolds lived there before he passed last winter. It needs work, but it has good bones, my uncle says." She paused. "It would be large enough for a small family, for the children." Matthew turned to look at her, his heart suddenly racing. "Are you suggesting what I think you are, Miss Winters?" She met his gaze steadily, though he could see uncertainty beneath her composure. "I'm suggesting that perhaps neither of us needs to face the future alone. That perhaps we've both been searching for something we didn't know we needed until now." "We barely know each other," he pointed out, though the objection felt hollow even as he voiced it. "I know you risked your life for a child you'd never met. I know you speak to Mary with the same respect you'd give an adult. I know you carry grief from your past but don't let it poison your present." Her voice softened. "I know that when you look at me, I feel seen in a way I never have before." Matthew's throat tightened with emotion. "Vera," he said, using her given name for the first time. "I'm a drifter. I don't know how to be anything else." "You already are," she replied simply. "You stopped drifting the moment you covered Samuel with your coat and called him son." The truth of her words resonated deeply within him. Matthew reached up to touch her face gently, giving her time to pull away if he had misunderstood her meaning. When she leaned into his touch instead, he bent forward and kissed her with a tenderness that surprised them both. It was a beginning rather than a culmination, tentative, questioning, but filled with promise. When they separated, Vera's eyes were bright with emotion. "Is that a yes, Mr. Blackburn?" He smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I believe it is, Miss Winters. Though I should warn you, I have no idea how to be a husband or a father." "Fortunately," she replied with a smile that warmed him to his core. "We'll have time to figure it out together." The ride to Clearwater Springs the next day was filled with a sense of anticipation that even Mary seemed to absorb, chattering happily about seeing her brother and the new adventures ahead. They arrived in late afternoon, the town's familiar buildings a welcome sight after days on the trail. Their first stop was the sheriff's office to deliver the bodies of the outlaws and report what had happened. Sheriff Dawson had returned from his own mission and listened with growing respect as Matthew and Vera recounted their experiences. "Billings is still out there," Dawson noted grimly, "but with his gang decimated, he'll likely move on to easier territories." "If he returns, he'll find this town better prepared," Matthew said, with a certainty that surprised the sheriff. "Does that mean you're planning to stay, Blackburn? Thought you were just passing through, like always." Matthew glanced at Vera, standing nearby with Mary in her arms. "Plans change, Sheriff. This town might need another gun, especially with 2 orphaned children to protect." Dawson's eyebrows rose as he looked between Matthew and Vera, noting their proximity and the unspoken communication that passed between them. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "About time someone managed to stake a claim on you, Blackburn." From the sheriff's office, they proceeded directly to Dr. Jenkins' house, where Samuel had been anxiously awaiting news. The reunion between the siblings was tearful and joyous, Mary flinging herself into her brother's arms while Samuel, still weak but improving daily, held her as if he'd never let go again. Dr. Jenkins observed the scene with misty eyes before drawing Matthew and Vera aside. "You found her," he said, clasping Matthew's hand warmly. "I confess, when my niece insisted on riding after you, I feared I might lose you both." "Your niece is remarkably capable," Matthew replied, his admiration evident. "She saved our lives." The doctor nodded, unsurprised. "Vera has always been exceptional. Stubborn, too." He looked between them shrewdly. "Something's changed between you two." Vera stepped closer to Matthew, her hand finding his. "We've reached an understanding, Uncle, about our future and the children's." Dr. Jenkins' expression softened with understanding. "I suspected as much when I saw you ride in together. It seems this rescue mission yielded more than just one small girl." That evening, after the children were settled in bed, Exhausted but happy to be reunited, Matthew and Vera sat in the doctor's parlor, making plans for their shared future. Dr. T. Jenkins had indeed been considering retirement and was delighted at the prospect of his niece continuing his practice in Clearwater Springs. "The Reynolds house would suit you well," he agreed when they mentioned Vera's idea. "Needs a new roof and some interior work, but the location is perfect, close enough to town for Vera's practice, but with enough land for a proper garden and, perhaps, some livestock. And room for the children to play," Matthew added, still marveling at how quickly his life had transformed from that of a solitary drifter to a man contemplating a family home. "Have you discussed timing?" Dr. Jenkins asked, his eyes twinkling with amusement at their obvious discomfort with the question. Vera straightened in her chair. "I believe a short engagement would be appropriate, given the circumstances. The children need stability as soon as possible. And I need your niece by my side before she comes to her senses," Matthew added with a smile that softened the self-deprecation in his words. Dr. Jenkins chuckled. 2 weeks should be sufficient. Enough time to announce your intentions properly and for Matthew to make a start on the house repairs. And so it was decided. The following Sunday, from the pulpit of Clearwater Springs Small Church, Reverend Miller announced the engagement of Miss Vera Winters to Mr. Matthew Blackburn, with the wedding to take place in 2 weeks' time. The news spread through town with the speed only possible in a small community, generating considerable interest and speculation. Matthew found himself the object of curious stares and good-natured ribbing as he purchased lumber and supplies for the Reynolds house repairs. The town's reaction to his decision to settle permanently ranged from disbelief to approval, with most people welcoming the idea of another capable man joining their community, especially one willing to take responsibility for the Morgan orphans. Vera, meanwhile, continued assisting her uncle while making preparations for both the wedding and the establishment of their new home. The women of the town, initially hesitant around the educated Easterner, rallied to help with wedding arrangements and offering household items for the family's fresh start. 2 days before the wedding, Matthew was working on the roof of what would soon be their home when he spotted a rider approaching Sheriff Dawson, looking uncharacteristically grim. "Blackburn," he called up. "Got some news you need to hear." Matthew descended the ladder quickly, wiping sweat from his brow. "What is it?" "Billings is back." Or at least, he was. The sheriff's expression was tight with anger. "Tried to rob the Wilkins place yesterday. Mrs. Wilkins was alone with the baby, but she managed to get to the shotgun. Winged him, but he got away." A cold weight settled in Matthew's stomach. "Which direction?" "South, but that doesn't mean much. He knows you're the one who killed his partners, and word of your upcoming nuptials isn't exactly secret." Dawson met his eyes squarely. "He might come for you, or worse, for those you care about." Matthew's jaw tightened. The happiness of the past 2 weeks had almost made him forget the threat that still lingered. "I'll be ready." "Not just you," Dawson said seriously. "I'm organizing extra patrols through town, and I'd advise keeping the children close until we know Billings is no longer a threat." After the sheriff left, Matthew returned to town immediately, finding Vera at the doctor's office. When he explained the situation, her face paled, but her voice remained steady. "We should move the wedding forward," she suggested. "Tomorrow, not 2 days from now. The sooner we're all together under one roof, the easier it will be to protect the children." Matthew agreed, and by nightfall, word had spread of the change in plans. The town responded with typical frontier practicality, adjusting arrangements without complaint. That night, Matthew insisted on staying at the doctor's house as an extra precaution, sleeping on a pallet in the parlor with his rifle close at hand. Morning dawned clear and bright, with no sign of trouble. By noon, the small church was filled with townspeople gathered to witness the union of the drifting cowboy and the doctor's Eastern niece. Samuel stood proudly beside Matthew as his best man, while Mary, beaming in a new dress sewn by the ladies of the town, scattered wildflower petals ahead of Vera. When Vera appeared at the church door on her uncle's arm, Matthew felt his breath catch. She wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her hair arranged in an elegant knot with a few curls framing her face. But it was her expression confident, joyful, and filled with love that truly captured him. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows taking on deeper significance for two people who had found each other against all odds. When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was a promise of partnership, protection, and a future built together. The celebration afterward was held in the town square, with tables laden with food contributed by seemingly every household in Clearwater Springs. Children played while adults ate, drank, and danced to music provided by local musicians. Matthew found himself surrounded by well-wishers, men who had previously known him only as a passing acquaintance, now treating him as a permanent member of their community. As evening approached, Matthew sought out his new wife, finding her in conversation with several women. The sight of her now Vera Blackburn still seemed miraculous to him. She excused herself when she saw him approaching, meeting him with a smile that warmed him to his core. "Happy, Mrs. Blackburn?" he asked, taking her hand. "Extraordinarily so, Mr. Blackburn," she replied, her eyes bright with joy and something deeper a certainty in their shared future that he found himself embracing completely. They collected the children, who had been thoroughly spoiled with attention and sweets throughout the day, and made their way to the Reynolds house now, the Blackburn home. Though not fully repaired, the most essential work had been completed, making it habitable if not yet perfect. Matthew carried Mary, already half asleep, while Samuel walked beside Vera, his hand in hers. As they approached the house, Matthew spotted a figure on the porch and tensed immediately, pushing Samuel behind him and reaching for his gun. "Easy, Blackburn," Sheriff Dawson's voice called out, "just delivering a wedding present." As they drew closer, they could see the sheriff standing over a bound man sitting slumped against the porch post billings, his face bruised and one arm bandaged, but very much alive and captured. "Found him skulking around the doctor's place," Dawson explained. "Figured he was looking for you or the children. Thought you might appreciate knowing he won't be a threat to your family anymore." Matthew stared at the outlaw who had caused so much pain, who had orphaned the children now in his care. For a moment, rage threatened to overwhelm him, but then he felt Vera's hand on his arm, a gentle reminder of all they had gained despite Billings's evil. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said finally, "best wedding gift we could have received." After Dawson departed with his prisoner, Matthew carried Mary inside, laying her gently in the small bed they had prepared for her. Samuel, though insisting he wasn't tired, was asleep almost as soon as his head touched the pillow in the adjacent room. In the quiet of their new home, Matthew and Vera stood in the simple parlor, the reality of their new life together finally sinking in. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked, suddenly uncertain in the face of such profound change. "This isn't the life you imagined in Boston." Vera stepped closer, her hands resting on his chest. "It's better," she said simply. "It has purpose, meaning. It has you and those children, and a community that needs us both." She smiled up at him. "Besides, I rather like being married to the man who was brave enough to cover an orphan boy with his coat and call him son." Matthew pulled her into his arms, marveling at how a chance encounter on a dusty trail had led to this moment, to a home, a family, and a love he had never dared to imagine possible. "I never believed in fate," he murmured against her hair, "until I found a boy sleeping in the dust." "Perhaps it wasn't fate," Vera suggested, her eyes meeting his with a wisdom that continually surprised him. "Perhaps it was simply the moment you finally allowed yourself to care, to connect, to belong." As Matthew kissed his wife in the quiet of their new home, with two sleeping children down the hall, who now depended on them both, he knew she was right. The drifter had finally stopped running, not because a woman or children had trapped him, but because he had at last found what he had been searching for all along. Not freedom from attachment, but the liberty to choose his own family, to build his own home, to write his own story. 5 years later, Matthew stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Samuel, now 12, helped Mary collect eggs from the chicken coop. Beside them toddled 3-year-old William, named for Vera's uncle who had retired to Philadelphia but visited regularly, and 1-year-old Elizabeth, who was currently attempting to chase a butterfly across the yard on unsteady legs. The town of Clearwater Springs had grown considerably, with Vera's medical practice thriving and Matthew dividing his time between their small ranch and serving as deputy sheriff. The community had faced its share of challenges: drought, occasional outlaw troubles, the normal hardships of frontier life, but had emerged stronger, more unified. As he watched his family, Matthew felt a familiar presence beside him as Vera joined him on the porch, slipping her hand into his. "Remembering something?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. "The day I found Samuel," he admitted. "How different life was then. How empty, though I didn't recognize it at the time." Vera rested her head against his shoulder. "And now?" Matthew smiled, watching as Samuel patiently showed Mary how to approach the more temperamental hens. The boy had grown tall and strong, with a natural way with animals and a protective instinct toward his siblings that made Matthew profoundly proud. "Now I have everything I never knew I wanted," he said simply. "A purpose. A home." He turned to face his wife, still struck by her beauty and the depth of feeling he saw in her eyes. "A love I never thought possible." Vera's smile held the wisdom and warmth that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "All because you stopped for a boy sleeping in the dust." "All because I stopped," Matthew agreed, pulling her close as their children's laughter rang across the yard, the sweetest music he had ever known. In that moment, with his wife in his arms and their children playing safely nearby, Matthew Blackburn, once a drifter, now firmly rooted, understood that true freedom wasn't found in endless wandering, but in the courage to stop, to care, to love. It was found in the simple act of covering an orphaned boy with his coat and saying, "Son," in recognizing another soul in need and choosing connection over solitude. It was found in coming home.